Hi, good afternoon and welcome to this conversation. It is the Bay of Banga conversation organized by the Center for Governance Studies here in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I am Chikodinaka, Peace Easy. And of course, the title of the session will be on misinformation, propaganda, and the state of media literacy across the country. I have on this panel some esteemed guests. I have joining me right now Siddharth Varadarajan. He is the founding editor of The Wire, a newspaper in India.
Hot website, yeah.
Hot website in India. Hi, and good to have you joining me. And of course, joining me also is Shamsud Doza. He is an editor with the Daily Sun.
No, I'm not the editor. I'm a journalist.
Oh, you're a journalist. Oh, he is a journalist, of course, and an aspiring editor, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe.
Good to have you join us.
Thank you.
All right. The world has gotten to a place where media remains very important. The media is an important tool in projecting news, in projecting literacy, of course, and of course in educating the world. The media can never be wish-washed when we talk about bringing the world together, and that is why the media takes preeminence in everything that has to do with information dissemination and of course educating and ensuring that the world is peaceful, as it were. But for this session, which will be focused on misinformation, propaganda, and the state of media literacy, we will be talking about how far the media has gone in ensuring peace is restored in some fragile countries, and of course fragile peace and worrying areas where we have crisis, pocket of crisis, violence, and the list goes on. But while we talk about the literacy of media, we shall also be looking at the issues as regards misinformation and the propaganda. We are at a stage in the world now where we have, where the media has expanded. We now have a new branch of the media, no longer talking about the traditional media alone, but the proliferation and the expansion of the new media, that is the social media. And on this subject, we will be focusing first on something that got the world glued to the television, which is the protests, the renowned protests that occurred in Bangladesh some 103 days ago. It is now 103 days after that protest, and of course that saw the coming of the interim government of Bangladesh. And Doza here will be taking us through how that impacted the economy of Bangladesh, how that impacted the people of Bangladesh and the socio-political well-being of the Bangladesh people. So could you let us in to how the protest began, what you feel led to the protests, and where we are now?
Yeah, so the protest started surrounding the issue of quota reform. That quota was basically for the government jobs, and earlier there were different type of quotas for different sections of people. So the students who are aspiring to be joining to the government services, so they demanded that those quotas should be reformed and largely reduced. So they kind of gave a percentage like 5%. And earlier the government, during the protest of 2018, the government itself removed the quota system. But this time they tried to reinstate the quota, and that's why the students, they took to the streets. So that's how the protest started. And the significant landmark of the protest events was the July 15, when the Prime Minister, she said that something that the students found very objectionable. So they took to the streets in a large number, and the student wings of the ruling party, they attacked the students, and that's how that took a violent turn. And then after that, we saw that the law enforcement agencies and different other law enforcement agencies like border guards, police, and also the ruling party activists, they attacked on the protesters across the country. So that violent turn and the consequent events of violences and death that led to the mass uprising during in the beginning of the August, and it took a huge turn on August 5, and then Sheikh Hasina had to flee the country. So that was the whole episode. And after that, if you ask me about its impact, so it was a kind of end of the 15 and a half years rule of Sheikh Hasina, and that was largely autocratic. Particularly after the 2014, there were two more elections, but the government and its total the machineries, they manipulated the election system, and that's why there were no political rights or democratic rights of the people. So now this is now a time of optimism for the people of Bangladesh. They think that this time they can bring many new changes, many reforms, and that will have a kind of, like they are talking about the reforms in the constitutions, reform in the media, reform in the banking system, reform in the political parties, election systems. So they believe that if these reforms can be implemented properly, so there is a bright future ahead for Bangladesh.
So apparently what we saw in Bangladesh was more like a youth revolt.
Of course, because
the government see it coming in the manner it came.
Now, the government, it is a kind of history in this region that before this revolution, there were two other mass uprisings, one in the 90s and one in 1969. And in all the three times, the government, they could not kind of like forecast that these things will get out of their hand, and that will take a violent turn, and that will be a huge mass uprising. This time also, the government initially they thought that okay, this is just a student quota reform movement, but students who took to the streets, they linked the quota issue with the every kind of discrimination and corruption the people of Bangladesh faced in the last 16 years. So that was not just a quota movement, but it became a protest, a movement against all forms of discrimination in the society. Yeah.
All right, Mr. Varadarajan, you and I and the media, as a founding editor, I believe you have gone through the whole ladder of the media sector, as it were. And as a founding editor in one of the renowned podcasts in India, a neighboring country to Bangladesh, of course, how did the protests impact India?
Well, the government of India was a supporter of the government which people were protesting against. So, and unfortunately, despite being a democracy, the media in India tends to follow the government's direction on many issues, but especially on foreign policy matters, and especially in relation to Bangladesh. So the tendency of big media in India in the beginning was to kind of report things, either ignore what was happening or to report things from the lens of the Hasina government. That what was happening was riffraff, disturbances that would be easily controlled. And when that didn't happen, then obviously the enormity of the change had to be reported. And even then, after the interim government came in, the media in India tried to exaggerate some of the dangers and some of the problems that emerged. For example, there was mob violence. The government evaporated in Dhaka and across the country. And there was mob violence for perhaps a week, 10 days. And many instances of Bangladesh's minority community, Hindus and Christians, Buddhists being attacked. So there was a tendency to look at the change in Bangladesh purely through that lens, and to, in a way, undervalue the importance of what had happened. And I believe, even to this day, the majority of the Indian media still looks at what has happened in Bangladesh with a great deal of suspicion and skepticism, which is unfortunate. Media houses are not investing the time and money to come here and understand.
If I may, Bolton, can you further expatiate on what you mean by suspicion and from the lens of skepticism?
Yes. So the narrative in the media in India, which reflects the narrative of the government, is that what has happened in Bangladesh is a process that is going to lead to the Islamization of Bangladesh, that will lead to the defeat of secularism. Many people speculate that You have foreign hands, foreign governments that were involved. So there's lots of conspiracy theories which are aimed at denying the role, the heroic role played by the students of Bangladesh and by civil society under very difficult circumstances. In fact, we should ask our colleague Mr. Doji about the media in Bangladesh, because I'm interested to know. I came to Bangladesh in April, a couple of months before the whole uprising, and the newspapers and TV channels were very bland. There was no reporting of what was actually happening, right? It was clear that they were intimidated by the government. So at what point during the student protest did the media realize that, okay, now we should do our job and we should not be afraid?
It felt as though the media in Bangladesh was gagged by the government.
Yeah, initially, yeah.
So what's the level of freedom for the press in Bangladesh?
So the situation of media during the Awami League regime, the Awami League regime that was ousted on August 5. So it was kind of that a large number of media was owned by the people from the ruling parties. That is one thing. And there are other medias like the media I work in, the Daily Star or the Prathamala, there are other legacy medias. So those were kind of constant pressure from the government and the ruling party activists. So, and also I must say there are also corporate interests linked to their kind of coverage of things. So the medias, those are kind of not directly owned by the ruling party activists. They try to maintain they maintain a safe position so that they can continue their business. So that was the thing. But during this revolution, up to July 15 was a turning point, because that day the ruling party activists, they kind of attacked the protesting students, and also the law enforcement agencies joined the ruling party activists. So that time the whole thing got violent and there were several deaths of students and other protesters. So from that day on, the medias, they kind of tried to provide extensive coverage of the killing incidents. And also there were discussions and opinion articles and also talk shows on the television channels that the merit of the demands of the students. So there was a kind of, they tried to play that, okay, the issue that should be addressed by the government immediately, otherwise it will got out of their hand. But the government, they are trying to like putting extra force on the students that will lead to their destruction. Yes.
Did you find the role of the military as heroic, in the sense that at some points in that protest, we understand that the military took a back set, because according to them, they did not find joy in further causing, more bloodshed, killing persons, because there were reports that some persons that were killed were also members of their household. Did you find that role as heroic?
No, I can't say that our mainstream media, they didn't play any heroic role.
No, I mean the military.
The military.
The military.
Oh, okay. This is kind of a if we look at the events more in details, you will see that initially the military, when the emergency was clamped on the Bangladesh on July 19, so the military was there, and there were incidents of shootings, and because the order was like that, shoot at sight order, so there were some incidents. But I can say that, okay, they restrained themselves from like large scale violence. Yeah, that is their credit. And also I think they also took the stance on behalf of the people when they finally came to the realization that it is not possible to resist the force of the mass uprising. So I think the way my assessment is like that. Yeah.
Now, looking at the role of the military vis-a-vis the media in Bangladesh, for instance, would you think that there was room for perhaps a proliferation of hybrid warfare, given what happened in Bangladesh, the quantums of killings, the number of persons injured, and how functional the social media was in times of this protest?
Yeah.
That we'd see a clear situation of hybrid warfare.
So generally, the term hybrid warfare, as I understand it and as it is commonly used, suggests that an outside power is using non-military means in order to overwhelm a government or another country. And I think all information that is available suggests that what happened in Bangladesh was a purely domestic indigenous uprising. Were there any outside powers with an interest in what was happening? Perhaps. We know that the government of India was supporting Hasina. We know that the government of the United States, for perhaps the past 3 or 4 years, had been very critical of Hasina. We know that young people have been using social media, and social media, like in any country, is subject to the usual forms of disinformation, circulation of exaggerated news, and so on. But I think what drove or propelled the change in Bangladesh, the primary driver, was the government's decision to use overwhelming, dictatorial, authoritarian, fascistic kind of force on people. So the way they opened fire on protesting people, coming against the backdrop of disappearances, arrests, intimidation of civil society activists in the media over the last 5 or 10 years, I think that was the tipping point. So I think that the hybrid warfare is not something that I would say was a dominant aspect here. And coming back to your interesting question about the military, I think that it's been for some time now that the military in Bangladesh has preferred to take a back seat. Unlike, say, in Pakistan, where the military, though again in Pakistan officially they're not in power, but they are very much, have a dominant role. In Bangladesh, I think that for a variety of reasons, the Bangladeshi military has scaled back its ambitions somewhat. And they would much rather that the so-called civilian authority rule, and that they, as long as their interests are taken care of. So for them, once they realize that the protests are genuine and, massive, and that they can only be contained with unprecedented use of force, I think they probably stepped in and told the Prime Minister that, look, you should leave. So I suspect her decision to leave the country, which put an end, which allowed the transition to happen finally, that was probably a decision that the army communicated to her, that, look, we can't protect you, and that for your own safety, you better leave. And they allowed her to leave. They could easily have also said, we're going to stop you. So they played a role enough to allow her to get out and facilitate some kind of a transition. But to the best of my knowledge, they are not driving the process right today.
Yeah.
Which is I suppose a positive.
But they
thing.
have support. They have full support for the interim government. Yeah.
Okay, so the military has strong support for the interim government.
And the reforms,
when we talk about the role of the military, the role of the press, and then we would also touch on democracy. How has the press, the military, helped to strengthen democracy in Bangladesh?
So the media, first, the media, they have been kind of, for the last 50 years, they have been talking about the democracy and human rights, these kind of things, although there are many limitations. And this time also, when we are talking about different type of reforms in Bangladesh, the media, they are playing a good role, like they are holding discussions on various reform issues, particularly the constitution, the election system, the political party system. So those kind of role they are playing. And in Bangladesh, after 1971, after the emergence of Bangladesh, the media, the mainstream media, they played a role of upholding the secular values. Because Bangladesh is a largely Muslim country, and there are different sections who try to impose their versions of Islam on the running of the state. but the media, they have maintained a kind of secular position, and the values of the, like, there should be secularism, there should be freedom of press, there should be freedom of expression, human rights, democracy, those kind of things. Okay, so that's their role. But sometimes, particularly even like the last 15 years, we saw that media always, they could not play their proper role, and sometimes they were sold off, and sometimes it happened that they do self censorship. So those kind of events also happened, and that affected the democracy. And if you ask about the military's role, so we in the last 50 years, we saw like almost 17 years of military rule, yeah, in various forms, yeah. So as Siddharth said, that okay, the military now, they play a more restrained role, or they scale back from their prominent role, or they are not coming to the forefront, but they were always kind of behind the running of the states. And also now, if you look at the present situation, you will see that there are many types of reforms, and the armies, they have their says. Not they are talking about those things and openly, but they have their positions regarding those issues, and those are kind of like taken care of by the interim government. Yeah.
All right. Touching further on this question I asked him on the role of the press, the military in strengthening democracy. Do you think it just ends with strengthening democracy? I mean, how can democracy be said to have been strengthened, without nipping issues of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda in the bud?
I think that democracy everywhere is under serious crisis. And the cause of this crisis, I think, has to do not so much, of course, disinformation plays a role, but I think the cause of the crisis of democracy worldwide is that democracy guarantees one vote per person, but it grants disproportionate power to the wealthy. Those with money and resources are able to drive the political process and are able to influence outcomes of democratic elections in ways that undermine democracy. In the United States, for example, politics is really a rich man's game, and it's a man's game. I underline that word too, but it's a rich person's game. And the kind of resources required almost guarantee that the people who get elected are beholden to wealthy financial donors, and they drive policy in their interest. So the role of people in democracies has been reduced to simply casting a vote every 4 or 5 years. There is no day-to-day control that they are able to exercise over their elected representatives, who answer to the people who paid for their campaigns. So these MPs or congressmen or senators are accountable to their donors rather than to their voters. And I think that this is, so in the US, for example, this has led to resentment against what's called the establishment. And you have versions of this in every country. It's a different matter that the response to this has been the rise of populism. So Trump, who is a very wealthy man himself, and who has a lot of support from within the establishment, is able to fool people. And that's where disinformation comes in. So you have propaganda, you have fake news, you have all kinds of ridiculous claims being circulated through social media. And it helps if the owner of a social media platform is your supporter, as in the case of Elon Musk. So you're able to weaponize this information in your favor. But I would say the fundamental problem that democracies need to address is the complete and utter lack of accountability of elected representatives towards ordinary voters. And either democracies find some way to limit the role of money power, or politics and elections will always be the game that privileged people can play. And I think this is really an issue that we need to, whether it's in Nigeria, I'm sure, or India, Bangladesh, or the US, UK, this is a common problem. And disinformation makes it worse.
All right, as we wind down this conversation, and of course, you have touched on how democracy can further be strengthened in a time of misinformation. Are you part of those who believe that citizen journalism should be checked in some ways?
That's a good question. I don't think it should be checked. I think that people should have. One of the great positives of the digital era is that it's allowed ordinary people to put information out there, right? But this is unchecked information. This is unverified. It doesn't necessarily pass through the same filters as conventional or proper journalism does. But what you do in a situation where established media houses consciously spread disinformation, where established media houses do not follow the rules of journalism. So it would be unfair to put restrictions on citizen journalists when you have mainstream journalism or big journalism that is not playing by any rules. So I think the more information that is out there, the better. Of course, information that is inflammatory, that incites hatred, incites insecurity, that can create problems. And in many cases, that would be a legal issue as well.